Hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining us on day 3 of the 2021 UBC China Forum. The UBC China Forum aims to provide a platform for constructive and nonpartisan discussions between business leaders and top academics from Canada and China. It's entirely student-run and not affiliated with any political parties or foreign embassies. My name is 𝐓𝐄𝐂𝐃𝐀, and it's my pleasure to be your MC. 大家好，欢迎来到2021 UBC 中国峰会第3天的议程，科技应用和中共济，共创未来。我是此次峰会的主持人杜安琪。
大家好，我是2021 UBC 中国峰会副主席，也是这次的主持人王玉阳。
此次峰会邀请来自各领域的专家、学者和行业领头人，分享最前沿的理念和经验，从而让此次峰会作为中加商业交流的学术平台，让世界更全面、更公正地了解中加商业。In the days to follow, we have the opportunity to hear from internationally renowned leaders in their respective fields and world-class scholars from top universities, gaining insight into, but ultimately shaping the dialogue between Canada and China.
同时，感谢 Look for Tutor、青幼教育、中国移动、National Bank of Canada、天安移民、Club Benefit Fund 战略合作伙伴、北大光华管理学院温哥华校友会、中欧国际工商学院温哥华校友会、UBC Institute of Asia Research、World Trade Center Vancouver、Canadian Ecosystem Institute、UBC Global Launch、华青会、校园合作伙伴、实习生、独家线上转播媒体北美留学生日报对本次峰会的大力支持。此次峰会将会在 UBC China Forum YouTube、北美留学生日报哔哩哔哩同步直播。加拿大用户使用饭团外卖峰会专属优惠码 BizChina CA， 美国用户使用 BizChina US 可享新人首单满20减10刀优惠。大家也可以扫描屏幕下方的二维码，关注我们的微信公众号和 Instagram， 观看峰会回放和了解更多峰会周边信息。
If you missed yesterday's session, we invite you to scan the QR code to our side to view our recap via the UBC BizChina Instagram account.
In yesterday's session, we had the privilege of discussing retail, and today we shift our focus to technology and innovation. 昨天我们进行了创新零售板块的议题，今天我们将为大家带来科技应用板块。
We open today's session with a conversation on trust with Andreas Weigand. As he speaks, we invite you to send any questions you may have in the chat box below to be addressed in the Q&A portion to follow. Andreas is a former chief scientist of Amazon, data coach at Alibaba, and author of the book Data for the People. He's a global expert on data and works on consumer data strategy and AI with organizations across tech, telecommunication, banking, travel, retail, healthcare, and many more. He's taught at Stanford and UC Berkeley, among other schools across the US and China. He's also the founder and director of the Social Data Lab. So starting off, Andreas, I'm curious, what does it mean to be a chief scientist at a company like Amazon?
Well, what does it mean to be a scientist? A scientist does experiments. So when Jeff Bezos realized that Amazon really has the ability to do experiments, do not go to some marketing professors to find out how they think consumers make decisions, but to actually see how consumers make decisions. That's when he had the idea of hiring a chief scientist. So doing experiments is the quick answer.
How would you say that compares with a role like data coach at Alibaba?
So the Alibaba story, very brief. I think the history of China is that the People's Republic started in 49. I was born in 59. 89, I went to Taiwan. And then 2001, there was a Stanford Asia Technology Initiative, which was basically run by an undergraduate, Chen Xiling, who is now a professor at Cornell. And he asked me whether I can be an advisor and I would get a free ticket to China. And I said, why not? So part of that was that we met with a few interesting companies, including SoftBank, which was a major investor into Alibaba at the time. And then Jack Ma heard about me, and then he invited me to basically teach him data. And I remember one of the distinctions I made was the distinction between a production engineer, a person whose value comes from writing code that doesn't break, exception handling, thinking about what all could go wrong, versus a data scientist like me or a glue programmer who takes whatever he can and puts it together to get a result and then, moves on. So there were many things at Ali at the time. And maybe I should tell one story. I was doing a workshop in Hangzhou, and then I talked about data. That's the only thing I ever talk about. And then some dude comes and stands in the door. And I talk about stuff. And then he says in perfect English, well, Andreas, when you say something can be wrong with the data, you need to be much more specific. Do you mean that you don't know what the data means? Do you think that there are measurement errors? Do you think that you don't trust the person who, collected the data? So it was all about trust in data. And I said, wow, good points. And who are you? And they said, oh, I'm Joe Tsai. I'm just the CFO here. And I have the utmost respect for Joe. So, ultimately, I think my role in these workshops is to facilitate, to have people have thoughts they might not have had before, and then to integrate amazing people like Joe. So data coach is a cool term, and it just means a coach helps people do things they wouldn't do elsewhere by themselves.
Awesome. So I guess diving deeper into the coaching side of things and the workshop side of things, I'm a little bit curious to hear about the teaching that you've done in China. So where you've taught and how that experience has been and maybe how that's different.
Yeah. So that actually first time was, I think, in 1994, before most of you were born, where I was at Beta. And the only thing I remember was it was extremely cold. So I was wearing my pajama and my long underwear and my pants and my suit all on top because they didn't really have heating in the classrooms. So I forgot what I talked about, but I remember that it was cold. But then, I went to Fudan, and that was much nicer, where I bicycled to the Bund. And then long story short, a few years later, I got a call while I was at Amazon from a person who was teaching at Shanghai Jiaotong Daxue. And he said, I knew him as a data scientist. He said, Andreas, can you help me out? I'm a good data scientist, but I absolutely failed teaching a course at Jiaoda for EMBAs. And I was at Amazon at the time, and I said, okay, I'll help you out. And I hopped on the next plane to Shanghai, and relatively unprepared, but still, did a reasonable job in telling stories to those EMBAs. And then China is small. The word gets across. So after Jiaoda, then actually a school which I actually really love, CBIS, China Europe International Business School, hired me to teach there for a few years. It's in Pudong. And then Tsinghua and a few schools. So basically, Fudan was the last one I taught at maybe 3 years ago when my book came out. So there are 10,000s of executives in China in that period, which was the first half of the 2000s, maybe until the 2000s, let's say, who listened to the stories which I had from the West about the internet, about data, how to think about data, how to innovate based on data. I just sent you a video which you are happy to repost from CCTV, China Central Television, on the English channel, interviewing me, about data and the like. And I had a friend who was in Beijing at the time, who I told that he can just come with me if he wants. I didn't know whether she really spoke English well, and he had studied in the United States. And I was an advisor to Xiaomi, the company head at the time, and he is now running Meituan, Wanxing. So that's actually a good interview. I just watched it again today from quite a few years ago.
Absolutely will do. So taking things back, you're mentioning 1994 and the early 2000s. So of course, with these conferences, it's much more common. The world is globalizing at an increasing rate. It's much more common for the East to learn from the West and vice versa. But I'm curious as to how your initial experience and presence got started in China. How did you end up initially going to China, and what was that like?
I think it was just driven out of curiosity. I think it was just, I always went just as a one-man show. So I never went there as an expert representing IBM or anything like this. I just went there as Andreas, and that's how people know me. By the way, and since we talked about China Mobile, 138-1818-3800. That's my China Mobile number. And that has a whole story behind how I got that number. But actually, the interesting thing here is, since I'm interested in identity, my SIM card is in my condo in Shanghai. And with the pandemic, with COVID, of course, I couldn't enter China. I couldn't enter China either. I couldn't enter Bangkok, Thailand. So it's very interesting how sometimes then a physical object like a little SIM card is what limits actually your communication. So I think it used to be very much that the best is the West, or the West is the best. Whereas now what we have seen with innovation in e-commerce, Pinduoduo being an example, is that maybe in the West, we should actually learn some of the innovations from China. And I mean, the people watching our show here are really equipped well of bridging between China and the West, or between the West and China. One final story. In one of the meetings with Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, so there were all her ministers and me and a couple of people on the other side, the digital advisory board. And she says, Herr Weigand, remind me, what do the Chinese say about Germany? And I said, do you really want to know? Yeah, remind me. Well, they say that in Germany, the coverage with dog shit is bigger than with telco services. Yes, right. And she moved on.
I love it. So you're a very trusting man, and you talk a lot about trust and identity. So I'm curious about what the role of trust has been in creating serendipitous moments for you through your career, or what you might think it might be for students coming up now, as well as whether that trust has caused detrimental moments.
I have a friend, Daniel Bauer here, who among his sayings is that his grandparents, when he complains about something, say, is it worse than getting bombed by the Japanese? They were in Shanghai at the time when that happened. So one of his sayings is that you can tell whether a person was loved by their parents and really trust the world, basically, or whether they don't. And, I just grew up and I trust most people, maybe more than I should, but in most cases, people actually respect this. And despite the many things I could have been in trouble with, I somehow managed to convince people that trusting Andreas as I am, make trouble to somebody else.
It's incredible.
Not really. But I think my recommendation is, if in doubt, I think you're better off to trust because trust breeds trust. Versus if somebody, for instance, doesn't tell you details, they just say, oh, I will be not available. Then, I mean, why don't you just tell me, oh, I'll be on a phone call or something? Because I think people are negotiating trust all the time. I want to talk about something before we run out of time. What has been on my mind in the last week? I have two friends, Josh Chin and Lisa Lin. And I did a video with Josh just on the stairs behind me a couple of years ago. He was the one who broke the stories about the Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang to the West. And I asked him, Josh, do I worry about you? And he basically said, if he was in Russia, I should worry about him. If, given he is in Beijing, well, they will just throw him out when they don't like it. And indeed, a year ago, Josh was among those journalists who got thrown out of China. And he is now with his wife in Seoul, and Lisa Lin is in Singapore. They're both brilliant journalists, and they wrote an amazing book. Here it is. Chin and Lin, Surveillance State. I've heard that Xi Jinping has sleepless nights after he had heard about the book. I'm not sure whether I can trust that source, but it is an amazing book, and actually it forced me to really brush up with my Chinese history. So I'm sure it will be banned in China, but then those of you in the West probably will have access once it comes out officially. And I really think it is an amazing book. Surveillance State by Josh Chin and Lisa Lin. This was an unpaid advertisement. I just believe in that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I remember on our call recently organizing, you were really excited about the chapter. So definitely recommend that. And thank you for sharing that before it comes out. So next, I'm curious, touching back on your experience with Merkel and with the Digital Council, how may it differ advising the private sector and the public sector and policymakers on data as opposed to your work in the private sector?
Thank you for that question. By the way, those who are watching, we did not prepare this. So that's a question Alex came up with. And I have to think about this for a moment. On the one hand, when it comes to the US, or when it comes even more so to Germany, the only two countries really I know a little bit about, my view is, don't try to write software for the government. Just use whatever Google or others are offering. But on the other hand, I also see that regulation is needed. So it's not black and white. It is really very much shades of gray. When it comes to China, I think we probably all share the view that initially, by the Great Firewall, make it difficult for Chinese people accessing, say Google, for instance, created an advantage for Baidu, etc. Baidu Maps, for instance, Erlemu, and whatever you have. Ultimately, as we have seen last month or 2 months ago, with actually the beautiful story by Lisa Lin in the Wall Street Journal, where is Jack Ma? Ultimately, I think in China, the government calls the last shots. So it depends on where we are talking And I think we should have a multi-pronged approach to help companies try to do the right thing, but then also governments, to the degree that they want to hear us, help them think about things in the right way. By the way, I found myself saying 2 years ago in Vancouver at the main TED conference that I trust Tencent more than I trust Facebook. So I've worked with people who run WeChat in Shenzhen, and I found them just to be honest, straightforward people. Versus Mark Zuckerberg, etc., is a story by itself. So it's not black and white. And I also think in terms of innovation, what the WeChat universe has to offer, I think Facebook is way behind it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I probably agree with that statement as a Facebook and WeChat user.
Right. You are all buy, meaning both on Facebook and on WeChat. So we all know what we use what for. No, by the way, very interesting for me is that thinking about privacy, which goes with trust, that I think most Chinese people, if WeChat told you when somebody has read a message, they would just think, no way, that way intrudes in my privacy. Versus, of course, Facebook tells you when the message has been read. And Apple does, although I turn it off in Apple. I think it's my business when I read a message. And that's what a person says who publishes every single flight they've taken for the last 20 years on Weigand.com. So I think it is multifaceted, multidimensional, and interesting to think about trust and privacy and data.
Yeah, that cultural dichotomy that you bring up has a lot of layers, and I wish we could dive into it a lot more, but we're going to jump into some questions from the audience right now. So the first question is from Frank on YouTube, and he asks, where do you see the future of data science and AI using blockchain technologies?
All right, great.
For sure.
So blockchain, in case anybody is not completely sure about it, blockchain is the idea that every single transaction gets written on a publicly viewable record. I have a very wonderful friend, Danny Yang, Y-A-N-G, Harvard undergraduate, Stanford PhD, and his previous company now publicly traded at the Toronto Stock Exchange, DMG Blockchain Solutions. One of the things they offered was for a fee to provide information who really the party is on the other side of the transaction. So you think that you're anonymous, you probably are not. And that not even in the People's Republic of China. So all the transactions basically are there forever. The computation aspects are non-trivial. The energy aspects are non-trivial. The same is true for all the cryptocurrencies. But I really love the idea that you cannot change the past. That is absolutely awesome. You know, maybe one other story here on the topic. Somewhere here is my crypto key. I mean, I have the box here right now. So in the years in China, I somehow had a few gold bars because I figured living in Shanghai, you never know, you might have to go to the hospital, and then bringing, $100,000 as gold might help get the attention you need. So when I left China, I needed to get rid of the gold because it's kind of difficult to put in your pockets or to smuggle it via the metal detector. So the challenge for the trust question was, well, how do I liquidate my gold, so to speak. And I met with a blockchain guy from Shanghai who just showed me a video of him being in trouble in Chengdu at the airport because he had some codes printed out where the police thought those might be codes corresponding to cryptocurrency, which they did. So I had bought my gold from ICBC, so I figured I'd go back to the branch where I bought it, near my place, Jiayuan, in Jing'an. And they said, oh no, we can't take this back. You have to go to a specific office on Nanjing Road. Monday, 10 o'clock, but don't be late. So I was with a friend and we thought, you know what? But we went there on Monday at 10 o'clock. We expected, moved in the side room, a big door shut behind us. And then in that room, they had a melting pot. So they were melting their own gold, which was still sealed with the chop on it from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. They were melting it and then figuring out what the purity was before giving me the money that corresponded to it. So much for trust and experiences and stories in China.
Yes, indeed. That's so interesting in the light of the topic of trust. So with that, I think that concludes our time today for this portion. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll return with the panel.
Great.
Thank you so much, Andreas.
And if anybody has questions in the break, I'm happy to stay on here informally. So we officially take a break, but if somebody wants to chat, I'm not going anywhere.
Absolutely. Hello and welcome back to the UBC China Forum. This brings us to today's panel discussion. We're joined by panelists Andreas Weigand, Olivera Zatezalo, Chief Security Officer of Huawei Canada, and Bill Tam, co-founder and COO of the digital technology Supercluster. The discussion will be moderated by Chris Pereira, President and CEO of the Canadian Ecosystem Institute. During the panel discussion, we once again invite you to ask any questions you may have in the chat box below to be addressed afterwards. We'll now hand it off to Chris to commence today's panel. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you everyone for being here today. So everyone, welcome. It's my great honor to welcome you to the technology panel as part of the 2021 UBC China Forum. My name, as Alex just mentioned, is Chris Pereira. I'm President and CEO of Canadian Ecosystem Institute. My company is a communication and market research firm helping to enable business opportunities between Canada and China, especially for tech-related startups like the ones we'll be discussing today and businesses between Canada and China. I have over 15 years of experience in and out of China and currently here in beautiful British Columbia, just down the street from Vancouver UBC campus. Today we'll be discussing tech trends, policy, and the greatest challenges and opportunities faced by tech here in Canada and overseas. Today's panel will be a discussion between the panelists with questions directed to each panelist individually. The UBC China Forum organizing staff will also be collecting questions from the audience during the panel discussion. And at the end of the discussion, if time allows, I'll also pose some of those questions to the panelists. So to get this started, I'd like to first introduce each of our esteemed panelists here today, and I'll start with Dr. Andreas Weigand. As we just heard, he's one of the world's leading experts in data and social networks. He's the former chief scientist of Amazon.com and an expert in big data, consumer behavior, and social mobile technologies, the combination of which he calls the social data revolution. He's convinced that we can hide nothing because man creates digital traces by living. During his time as chief scientist at Amazon, he analyzed Amazon's user data and was involved in the development of the company's data strategy and innovation culture. Dr. Weigand teaches at both Stanford University and the University of California, Berkeley. His clients include Alibaba, BMW, Deutsche Telekom, and Lufthansa. As a much sought after international speaker, Andreas Weigand shows what amazing possibilities data offers and what the social data revolution means for business, people, and society. So welcome, Dr. Weigand. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Our next panelist is Bill Tam. Bill Tam is recognized as one of the preeminent leaders of the BC tech sector. A lifelong entrepreneur, Bill has been actively involved with technology and startups as a founder, executive, investor, advisor, and board member for the past 20 years. And in 2017, Bill co-founded the development of the digital technology Supercluster and currently serves as the Chief Operating Officer. The Digital Technology Supercluster is part of the Government of Canada's $950 million 5-year Innovation Superclusters initiative. That's aimed to drive large-scale collaboration among industry leaders, small and medium enterprises, as well as post-secondary institutions to develop and scale high-potential technologies in Canada. A champion of entrepreneurship, Bill forges partnerships across private and public sectors to accelerate economic growth and foster inclusiveness. Bill also serves on the Innovation Committee of the Rideau Hall Foundation and is an industry advisor at the University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Oh, welcome, Bill.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, our third panelist, Olivera Zatezalo. Olivera is the Chief Security Officer at Huawei Canada. Her responsibility is to ensure Huawei Canada's operations are compliant with Canadian cybersecurity laws and regulations. With over 20 years of experience in the telecommunication industry, Olivera is best known for creating value through collaborative leadership style, agile execution, and for her global cybersecurity expertise. Up until joining Huawei Canada, Olivera was responsible for cybersecurity governance, management, and operations within an international communication, responsible for cybersecurity governance, management, and operations within an international communication provider operating in Canada, the US, and the UK. She was also a member of the Canadian Security Telecommunication Advisor Committee. Recently, IT World Canada and the Women in Security and Resilience Alliance have named Olivera one of the top 20 women in cybersecurity in Canada for 2020. And Olivera holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from University of Belgrade and is a certified information security manager. So welcome, Olivera.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, great to have all three of you here on the panel. And today, of course, we're talking tech, whether it's trends, policy, and everything in between in terms of opportunities and challenges. I'd like to pose the first question to Dr. Weigand, if it's okay with you, Dr. Weigand. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the fact that we as digital users can hide nothing, as you say many times in your books and in your writings, your speeches, and that data monopolists like Amazon, Facebook, and Google have to make the data that they make commercially available. They should make it available to all. So in an encroachment on privacy, is an encroachment on privacy a necessary trade-off for increased connectivity? And can we create privacy respecting and privacy enhancing policies while at the same time sharing and using that data?
Yeah. About a month ago, I ran this quarter's Social Data Summit, and the topic was data fears. So we talked about the fears we have about our data, whether it is fears that something which you thought nobody knew surfaces, your searches on Pornhub or whatever, or whether it is something which you thought you have just disappears, gets lost, which of course China Mobile will make sure that it won't disappear in the cloud. So what are the fears I think we have about our data? And for me, and for the people I had on my panel, it's at datafears.com. The question really wasn't that we worried about what companies can do with the data against us. The worry we have is what can governments do with the data against us. And I mean, my dad was in prison in East Germany because the Stasi thought he was a spy. So somehow I probably know a little bit more than what I'm talking about when I say those things here.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Weigand. Bill, I wanted to just follow up on that from a more investment perspective with the Digital Technology Supercluster. And speaking about tech and data, I know the Digital Technology Supercluster is part of the government's investment of $950 million into driving large-scale collaboration between industry leaders, small and medium enterprises, and post-secondary institutions. So how competitive is Canada in this, and including what Dr. Weigand just mentioned in terms of data sharing and usage and the tech space? And what challenges and opportunities are you seeing in the next few years?
Thanks for that question, Chris. I think Canada kind of stands at the precipice of tremendous opportunity if we can leverage the reputation that I think we've kind of won hard over the last several decades as being a nation that values the balance in terms of human rights and privacy protection for its citizens, recognizes and respects the rule of law, and understands democratic freedoms in the context of how to best use and serve public good. And so in that regard, I think if you have that reputation, I think it's incumbent on us to kind of look at how we can propel sort of technology platforms and governance technologies that actually help to promote that on a much more, not just domestically, but from a global leadership position. And so I think that's a lot of what our thesis was in developing projects around the digital superclusters, looking for collaborations that can derive sort of expertise from multiple parties to develop products and services and capabilities that can actually extend our global opportunity around that. I think we've seen some evidence that in the areas of trust and privacy, Canada has led. Certainly I think much of what was done in the relationships that Canada had forged goes back almost 10 years with Facebook in kind of trying to determine what is the right privacy policy that a large platform like Facebook needs to undertake. I think Canada was at the forefront of that. And our chief privacy commissioner at the time went on to do much of the same kind of stuff in the UK, in the European Union. And I think Canada still has much of that expertise, particularly here in British Columbia, that it has to offer not only in the country, but around the world. So I'm quite bullish on where things can go if we take advantage of this position from a country's perspective.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think Canada does hold a great position in terms of leadership, in terms of course, human rights and where we are in technology. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to pose the next question to Olivera. Olivera, one of the goals of the UBC China Forum is to encourage dialogue and encourage engagement between Canada and China. And that includes giving a platform to many different voices. This is a technology panel, of course, in the China Forum. So our discussion is definitely focused on the tech side. But before we jump into more tech-focused topics in cybersecurity, I did want to make sure we address an important issue that was recently raised that is related to the Canada-China relationship. A recent mainstream media report in Canada mentioned a letter sent to the organizer of China Forum asking them to disinvite Huawei, due in part to claims that Huawei technology is being used against the Uyghur minority in China, including equipment and solutions being used in Xinjiang to allegedly racially identify and control the local Uyghur minority. Can you please address this issue today?
Yes, Chris, I'm aware of that, and thank you for bringing this issue up front. So what I would like to say to these young people raising this issue, that 27 years ago, in early 1990, I came to Canada from war-torn former Yugoslavia. So unfortunately, I had experienced a pain of civil war, and I also understand the survivor's guilt of being safe and secure in Canada and not knowing what your family is going through and are they going to make it through the night. So anyway, I'm sharing this with you to ensure you all that I do understand the depth of human suffering during uncertain times, and that I would never ever approve the use or support the use of technology to oppress people. So anyway, as a grateful Canadian and also very proud engineer who spent over 25 years building and securing networks in Canada, I'm here today to talk to you about the work I have done with Canadian government on securing Canadian networks and making sure that equipment Huawei has sold to Canada is up to Canadian laws and regulations.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Oliver. Just to follow up on that, maybe just a follow-up question, Oliver, about cybersecurity now. And we talked just now, Dr. Weigand also mentioned the sharing of data and using data and encouraging data collectors to share it and use it more effectively. And speaking of the Huawei equipment and cybersecurity, I guess another concern for Canadians is the security of data and data privacy. So should we be concerned about that, and why or why not? How does Huawei deal with that?
So Huawei has been in Canada for over 12 years right now. In 2008, Huawei has established security review program with Canadian government and Canadian carriers. So this program is used to test all Huawei equipment that is used in Canada. And Canadian government came out and talked about that publicly in October 2018. So all equipment that is deployed and used in Canada have been tested using the testing protocol programs recommended by Canadian government.
Dr. Weigand, you mentioned the use of sharing data, making it public, and given that private information is routinely used by state and corporate actors, can we really claim to own our data, and who actually does own data when it's put into the public sphere, in your opinion?
Thank you. I think the question there is, what does it mean to own data?
Yeah.
So historically, we know what it means to own an apple. I can eat it, or I can give it to you, whatever. Data is much more tricky because, if I sort of through some channel, fork over some data to you, then, I kind of still have it. So what does data ownership mean? It probably means that you can act upon the data. And for me, we are in a time where we could not live without data. So the chairman of Google wrote in a letter, the chairman of Axel Springer, the largest European daily publisher, wrote to the chairman of Google saying, don't fool the world by trying to tell us that we have a choice whether to use Google or not to use Google. And I think it's very tricky that we want, so let me restart this one, take two. The answer to your question is a dilemma, the data dilemma. And the data dilemma means, and it's best said by David Brin, who I really admire for his writings, we want privacy for ourselves and accountability for everybody else. And so that intrinsic dilemma, which you cannot just resolve, is at the heart of any of these decisions.
That's great. Thank you very much. Bill, talking about, to have really effective AI, of course, AI relies on data and accessibility of data. And I think a lot of, especially younger people in our audience will be worried about a few questions, including, will I be automated one day? So what about AI, and what are some challenges regarding also AI security? So again, the more effective the AI is, the more access to data and information it has in some ways, and protecting privacy while at the same time bringing efficient applications to market. And like I mentioned just a minute ago, are we going to be automated? Will our jobs be taken over by machines? This sort of question. Can you address that?
Wow. So there's a lot to your question, and I think I can maybe scratch the surface a little bit. I think as Dr. Weigand was just saying, a lot of it resides around access to data in the first place, because you have to train the AI engines to kind of understand how best to tune the algorithms. So, at the very core of it is, well, what information can you get access to? How do you go about commingling data sets and actually developing things that are truly workable? The second element is, of course, there's been much discussion about inherent biases. And those biases may be because of the type of data that you actually have access to. It may be because of the way in which algorithms are developed. So there's a whole matter of discussion that's happening on a multinational basis to look at the ethics and the use of AI. What are responsible practices for how you actually can develop the appropriate sort of algorithms to use, and ultimately, how do you build the accountability back in? Because in the end, I think that the biases that exist will persist, and then the question is, well, how do you build accounts for that? And the third area I think is a bigger question is, well, what is the impact on all of us as citizens of the world? How does this fundamentally change the nature of employment, our opportunities from an economic standpoint, and the proper functioning societally in terms of where AI fits? I think those are really, really big questions. I think for now, AI is sort of in the realm of, the things that are the lowest hanging fruit, right? So we're looking at, how we can apply AI for things like automated transport and self-driving cars? How can we use AI to kind of augment the human experience in terms of analytics or predictive modeling? Well, how can we use AI to perhaps kind of run some base level robotics and industrial applications? You know, for the most part, I think the early experiments in terms of how this will actually operate, but I think the bigger question about how it's going to upset the environment for all of us and what we work and how we live and how we play, you know, those there's some big questions still to be answered there. I think the most important aspect is that we have dialogues like this and many others to really understand the appropriate use of that in a manner in which we could absorb that as a human race.
That's great. I see Dr. Weigand shared a link in the.
Yeah. So I only have a few books here within reach. And I already mentioned Josh Chin and Lisa Lin's Surveillance State. Another book which I think very highly of is this book. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow. In May last year, Daniel and I had a conversation at the Aspen Institute, which you can find on weigand.com/Kahneman, if there's a way for you to post that. And what we talked about was the question about whether actually there is an objective function which we want to have that we know to optimize. So my view from my Amazon days is whatever you want to optimize, we can optimize. The question is what is it that you want to optimize? And in that conversation with Daniel Kahneman, Danny made the point, and now I'm quoting him, it matters on lives and livelihoods, and maybe also in matters of love. People do not want to have their objective function made public. So when it comes to lives, COVID, livelihood, also COVID, and love, probably most people might not want others to know what terms are in the objective function.
Great. Thank you very much. Olivera, talking about AI and cybersecurity, I guess two parts to my next question for you is how has the pandemic impacted cybersecurity? I guess in terms, I really like what Dr. Weigand just mentioned, lives, livelihood, and love. Not sure which of those fit into cybersecurity specifically, but we can discuss that. And also related to AI, is AI a big part of cybersecurity these days, and how does that fit in?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Chris. So the pandemic impacted the cybersecurity. So yeah, we all stayed home. We used network to work from home. We use network to socialize, and we also use network to entertain ourselves. So from the telecommunication providers, network availability was very important, and there comes performance monitoring to make sure that network is available all the time, because availability is one of the pillars of the cybersecurity. Also, we moved all our social and economic transactions online, and we started to create a huge amount of data as we were doing that. So some of this data is very trivial, but some of this data has a very sensitive and very private information, like credit cards, SIMs, and stuff like that. So basically, that opened another set of issues in a cybersecurity. How do we protect this data? And I would say the first category of issues was the accelerated digital transformation. So what we have seen during the pandemic, a lot of enterprises, smaller or bigger, they started moving to the cloud, they started accelerating their digital transformation. And this opened a lot of other questions from the cybersecurity perspective. So can we rely on VPN as the secure tunnel to our enterprise, or do we need to start thinking about zero trust architecture and zero trust architecture and the model? This is never trust anyone, and always verify and continuously monitor the access to the data. So a number of different security issues have been opened up during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So Bill, going back to sort of the future trends in tech, we talked sort of a bit about the opportunities, but are there any tech trends that you're concerned about or worried about, whether it's in terms of investment direction or tech itself? Well, going back again to lives and livelihood, I sometimes view technology as like nuclear technology, right? You can either make energy or make bombs, whether it's AI or big data and that sort of thing. So are there things that you're concerned about and would like to mention right now?
Yeah, there's always a choice, I think, in every sort of major technological development that, you know, you can either use it for good or you can weaponize it. And I think that's true, whether you're talking about things like energy or whether you're referring to even how, you know, the entirety of the social media wave has kind of been washed upon us. So, you know, no matter what, I think it comes back to human judgment and how we apply the rule of law and how we kind of work together as an international community to kind of uphold whatever framework of human rights that we believe is important. You know, I think one of the things that at some point we will have to sort of deal with is how the legal system will approach things like AI. You know, we saw the rise of sort of the corporate entity back, oh gosh, centuries ago, when, you know, entities, corporations became, you know, in many respects in law, an element or an entity itself, and it has its own sort of set of rights and obligations. At what point are we considering the same framework for AI? And that intersection point is, I think, worthy of lots more discussion. I think for me, it's a worrying piece because, you know, while we want to uphold sort of elements of trying to introduce more AI technology into the world, well, what will be the safeguards and what will be the mechanisms by which we have to kind of back off certain things when we need to? And I think that comes down to both a regulatory and a legal framework that still has to be worked through.
Yeah, I'd love to ask Dr. Weigand the same question. Just one thing I ask my students a lot, I think it's a really interesting question, is what if one day you type in a Google search and Google says, no, I'm busy right now, sorry. What's the response to this, right? So, Dr. Weigand.
So last year, for a few months, I had access to Clearview Ai. So for those of you who don't know what Clearview Ai is, it is an app, or it is you take a picture of someone and you upload that picture to Clearview Ai and they return pictures of the same person, including the web addresses, the URLs of those pictures. And it's absolutely crazy how powerful that is. I innocently started with a selfie of myself, 178 images returned, only one mistake. And by far the most interesting experience was somebody on a relatively sketchy website, and it turned out that he now is at Harvard Law School, and we talked. And I think that for me is by far the most interesting thing, that boundary or that wall between the physical and the online, the digital, has completely disappeared. In this case, Clearview Ai, Juan Tontat, and a few people, a small operation in New York. There's no question in my mind that many companies in China do that at least just as well. So that, I think, is the question, or that's the status quo which we have. Nothing theoretical about it. Yeah. Clearview Ai was actually an interesting experience last year.
Oh,
I'm happy to add an experience from a totally different domain this year.
No, I'd love to hear it. No, go ahead. We'd love to hear it. And I've got a next question for Olivera after that.
Okay. for this year, it is a company called Dscript, a Canadian company actually, which has a company here in San Francisco called Overdub. And I trained Overdub with my voice. I think it was 30 minutes of reading Wizard of Oz. And I now can type in any sentence and it renders the sentence to the degree that that old friend of mine I mentioned, known for 30 plus years, that he on the phone could not tell that it wasn't me, but my fake voice talking. So I think that is where the word I am fascinated about. What can we trust? And what does this mean in terms of plausible deniability? When, you know, I heard it with my own ears, and then I say, but that wasn't me.
Yeah, what is true? It's a more complex question than at first glance once things can be imitated to that level, right? It's amazing. Olivera, I wanted to bring you to, I saw on your LinkedIn a few weeks ago during Women's Day, you shared a photo of yourself with about 20 men standing out very, very clearly on stage.
Yes.
And that picture left a deep impression on me. And I wanted to ask if you had any words of advice for women interested to get in technology in the industry, and just maybe share your thoughts and experience as a woman in tech. And I think it's, I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, but I'm sure you're in the minority rather than majority in that industry. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's very true. So thank you for asking that question, Chris. So it's becoming very clear to us that cybersecurity is becoming of critical importance to Canadian economic development. And it's also becoming very clear to us that we don't have enough expertise in cybersecurity. And when you look at the numbers, it's also very clear there is an untapped potential there within the women's in Canada. And what we would like to say is that in order to join a cybersecurity, you don't need to be an engineer or you don't need to have a computer science degree. There are so many different domains in cybersecurity that we need experience from different, like for example, women who are teachers can do a great job in security awareness or employee trainings or cybersecurity. So I'm very active working with the Canadian women in cybersecurity. I'm on advisory committee. We do have annual conferences, and we are trying to encourage more girls to join and to look for careers in STEM and also to look for careers in cybersecurity. The numbers are growing up. Like 3 years ago, we only have 11% women in cybersecurity. Last year, 24%. So we are making good progress.
No, it's fascinating. I'd like to extend that question to Bill and Dr. Weigand also, just in terms of encouraging youth to get involved in technology in general. I like to count myself as relatively young, but my interns would call me out on that. But I think when they're studying at university these days, there's a lot of questions about what should they study. You know, does everyone need to know a bit of AI, programming? Personal communication skills are more important than ever, in my opinion, even though we're connecting by technology more and more. So just curious, if you were giving advice to someone choosing a major or studying these days, what would you tell them? I'll maybe start with Bill first.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Chris. I think as everyone in the current generation, as they've kind of grown through an online sort of upbringing, you know, it's virtually inseparable that they understand technology and the use of technology. I think they've all grown in the internet age. So I think it's going to be inescapable that everyone that will participate in the new economy will have to have some sort of grounding in the understanding of the new applied sort of technologies, including AI, data, and sort of digital technologies more broadly. For youth, I think, you know, it has been quite remarkable as we've kind of looked at the impact of the COVID pandemic on sort of the population at large. And I think certainly here in North America, we've seen, you know, much of the youth really get stranded as they kind of come into the workforce in terms of the absence of opportunity that's brought on by the response to the pandemic. And so a couple of things that I think we've been part of is to try to look at pathways to encourage sort of cross-training in these new areas, allow more underrepresented youth to participate in digital technologies, not only from the standpoint of the education mix, but really meaningful sort of work placement opportunities. We announced something recently with Microsoft and an organization non-for-profit called NPower to basically roll this out to 2,500 sort of youth in Canada to give them exposure and opportunities in these areas. And I think it's just the beginning of much of what still has to happen. I don't think it has to be the case that youth have to enroll in computer science or engineering. I think to the extent that there's some sort of exposure lens across sort of different domains as they go through their field of study, that's going to be most important for them to become more adept at how to use this technology in their everyday work experiences.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Weigand, did you want to chime in?
Yes. On April 3rd, on a Saturday morning at 10:15 a.m. Pacific time, I will have a conversation with a friend of mine. Her name is Amber Yang, and she's an undergraduate in physics at Stanford. And what we're going to talk about is how she sees, as a very bright undergraduate, the world, what questions she has actually towards physicists. And we have a panel of a few of my friends and trying to figure out, where we are in a historically relatively male-dominated world. But the department chair at Stanford is a woman, Persis Drell, who is a colleague of mine when we did our PhDs. She is the provost at Stanford. So I think I'm very happy to see that we have many more women in key positions in science and in engineering as well.
That's very good. That's April 3rd at 10:15, right? Thank you.
April 3rd, weigand.com/physics.
Awesome.
So my last name, weigand.com/physics, is a website or a Google Doc I will create. I haven't done it yet, but that's where it will be. The date has been fixed for April 3rd in the morning, 10:15 Pacific.
Right. Yeah. We've talked about, I guess, the business side, the private sector, and I guess with the digital technology supercluster, I'm not sure if that touches on, I guess it does touch on policy also, Bill, and this is a question I'll go to yourself, then Olivera and Dr. Weigand also, but just your advice in terms of how to make Canada more competitive in the future, how to encourage more, what you would say to, I guess, China and Canada in terms of policy and what we can do to encourage growth and I guess positive growth in technology for Canada and China.
Yeah, that's a great question. We touched lightly on policy only from the standpoint of looking at how it's applied in industrial applications and how it affects research and development projects. But what I can comment on is, recently the Canadian government introduced Bill C-11, which is really an overhaul of the privacy legislation. It tries to capture some of the strategies that were set out in the digital charter that was published about a year and a half ago, and tries to align Canada's interests around international frameworks like GDPR and other sort of privacy mechanisms. What's important about it is, it creates sort of the framework for allowing, trade agreements like the Comprehensive European Trade Agreement, CETA, and others to properly function. But from a Canadian competitiveness standpoint, I think it was important for us to actually be at the table and to begin things, doing things along those lines. I think one of the impediments that we have is that we still have this federal and provincial sort of gap. We still have provincial jurisdictions that have their own set of policies around privacy. And that inconsistency actually creates cost barriers for organizations that seek to kind of advance whether it's their products or their initiatives or what have you. And so to the extent that there's better streamlining across federal and provincial areas, and to the extent that Canada works in conjunction with more on the international stage, it harkens back to the comment I made at the very beginning that says Canada stands at a position where we can leverage our relative standing on the international world for our reputation to really further, conversations around things like use of AI, around the development of data trust, about data governance models, proper and appropriate use of regulations in the digital context. But we can only have those conversations if we are legitimately sort of furthering it in our own country. And that means a lot more harmonious legislation between the provinces and the federal government.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Olivera, did you want to chime in?
Yes. So I think what we have seen over the last few years is the higher privacy requirements across the different, whether it's AI development or IoT development or any use cases in a 5G. In order to have a good privacy protection, you really need to have a good cybersecurity framework. So cybersecurity is the foundation for privacy protection. So whenever we go into developing these new use cases, whether it's in the 5G or IoT or artificial intelligence, it is very important to think ahead about cybersecurity and privacy frameworks and protection. What policies do we need to have in place in the corporations developing these use cases? So I think what's important to understand there is it's important to look at AI reference architecture. It's important to clearly understand different roles and responsibilities that people play throughout that process. And it's also time to look into and call for international standards to be adopted for the development as well as for the testing. On the top of that, on the top of the standards to be deployed, I think it's also important to understand the laws and regulations, especially around AI, cybersecurity, and privacy.
Great. Thanks very much, Oliver. Dr. Weigand, did you want to chime in on that one? Advice in terms of policy to Canada or China or the US, given your background?
Don't really have anything to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to put you on the spot for the next question then, and just relating to jobs and work. Right now, because of COVID-19, many of us are working at home, and most of us, and it's become, especially including my company, it doesn't really matter where people are, where they could be in Canada, China, could be in Fiji, and as long as the time zones align, a lot of the work can be done anywhere. Do you think that's going to continue after the virus becomes less prominent in our lives? And how does that relate or matter in terms of borders in the future and Canadian jobs, for example, or jobs in China? And do you think we're going to be working more remotely in the future?
Was this for me?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I don't know much about Canada. But what I do believe is that we vastly underestimate the effect that work from home has on people's mental health. Even when I worked at Amazon, I said, main reason I work at Amazon is that there's a cafeteria. I can randomly walk into have lunch. Everybody knows, admittedly not a very good lunch, but there are always people for me to talk to without having to make plans. Similarly, when I did my PhD at Stanford, I was in a co-op, and the great thing was, at 6 o'clock every night, there's food cooked by others, and you once a week have to cook or to clean up. But you don't have to make plans, and you keep your mental health, you keep your sanity by just being with people. What you mentioned very early in the introduction when you talked about serendipity. So I think that the world is fooling itself when they hail the increased productivity by not looking at the effect this has on serendipity and on, as I said, the mental health, the mental well-being of people.
Yeah, I've heard that as a theme many times the last few months. I think that's a very, very astute observation. I've actually got questions from people watching on YouTube and Bilibili. We have a few minutes, and I just wanted to give a chance to have the audience ask a few questions. And this first one I'll pose to Bill. This is from Terry Zhang, who's watching on YouTube. And the question is, how do startups compete in the age of big data, where big corporations can leverage their data to identify upcoming trends much quicker than a smaller company can?
So I have had that conversation with my dear friend Raven, who is originally from China, was in Singapore, was my TA at Berkeley, at Stanford, and at Fudan. And basically, the answer is we are hosed. There is no chance for any startup to compete with the data. And now you can fill in the blank, Google or Facebook or, the Tencent, WeChat, Baidu probably, Ali, and Financial has. So, I mean, we can only say hallelujah.
Bill, do you agree
that
we're hopeless? Are we reliant on Google and Facebook?
Well, I think you really have to stand back and define what success means to a startup, right? So, even if there are big platforms in existence today and they get bigger and bigger every day, the rate at which startups are continuing to form, the rate at which startups are able to succeed still continues unabated. And I think more and more what they're able to do is look at avenues where they can take advantage of slivers of network capacity or network leverage through some of these platforms in order to kind of further their startups. And I think the most adept startups will actually recognize that it isn't necessarily about the monumental task of becoming the next Google. It is simply about understanding whether they can serve a particular market using the kind of information that might be had on these platforms or derived in some other way through other mechanisms in order to kind of further a value proposition that they're developing. So, and that's why I think you're still continuing to see a whole number of startups that will succeed in that manner. I've never been bearish on the opportunity for new emerging startups to succeed. What we will probably find is, in 10 years or so, will there be a replacement of any of these big platforms by something that was only formed in the last 5 years? And I'm bullish that we may see some evidence that could happen. And so I maybe take a little bit of a contrarian view to Dr. Weigand on that one.
No, I think you're right. OnlyFans.com being a wonderful example.
Yep. I've got a question from Yan Chan from YouTube. I'm not sure who to pose this one to, so I'm going to throw it out to you guys. It's relatively technical. It says, what level of integration and API need to be facilitated to succeed in multi-cloud setups and or the marketplace? And I would maybe have a second follow-up to that is, do we need, if we're in the tech industry, how much AI do we need in the future? And do you think it's going to become like you make a website? Do you think you could just drag and drop AI solutions in the future? Or do we really all need to know the nitty-gritty of an AI solution? And I'll put it to Bill first, and I'll go to Dr. Weigand after.
Sure. So you're going to the least informed to the most informed. That's great. I guess my view is, the question on the APIs. I mean, there already are. It depends on the nature of the application set and the particularities of what data is being integrated. But we've seen the emergence of standards. We do a lot of work in the digital health side. So, the emergence of standards around HL7 FHIR and, how data is being integrated and sort of standardization of that information set is one of the things that allows data clouds to be combined. Most of the private cloud providers understand that there is going to be a thing around portability, and integration is part of that. We've seen successively that, applications that provide middleware functions between different sort of platforms have always found a niche for things. And, even in the case of the internet, we saw all sorts of sort of interactions, whether, you look at Tim Bray's work on the World Wide Web on just having XML tie different sort of capabilities around sites. I'm sure the same would be the case with AI tools. I'm sure the same will be the case with data lakes and data trusts. We certainly have projects that are doing similar things like that. So if there is a need, it will be filled. And the question really is, will startups take advantage of that?
And Dr. Weigand, anything out there?
Yeah. So when I was a postdoc at Xerox PARC, we always used to joke that AI is whatever hasn't happened yet. So many of the things that people invented at PARC in the 90s, are now everywhere. So the question really for me is, what is the meaning of the A in AI? And it shouldn't be artificial intelligence. What it is, it's not a race against the machine, but it's a race with the machine. So it's an assisted intelligence. It is something which helps all of us every day. And if you think for a moment, a day without Google or a day without Baidu would be hard. A week without Google, a week without Baidu, I wouldn't know how to do that.
And maybe, Chris, if I may add, just
Of course. Yeah.
two issues that I see from my perspective is explainability and traceability when you use APIs in the AI. So what I mean by that, you have to be able to clearly explain where did you get the data, and to have to be able to clearly trace the logic that is used in coming up with the AI algorithms. So I think we're going to see a legal requirements in that area too, like look at it in healthcare, autonomous driving, all these laws and regulations as to, how do you explain, if the accident happened, who is to be blamed and stuff like that. So I think these issues should be also taken into account, traceability and explainability of the logic used in AI.
Great, thanks very much, Oliver. We're coming up onto the half hour, so I'd like to give each of you, I'll start with Olivera, maybe the last 30 seconds, your final thoughts about tech in terms of the China Forum, whether it's China, Canada, the US, and just a 30-second wrap up. Now I'll start with Olivera.
So what I would like to say is definitely the world around us is changing with the 5G rollout starting last year and with the pandemic. We are entering a totally different age. It's an age of intelligence, and it's very important to understand what we are dealing with and to take advantage of
that. Bill?
Thank you very much, Chris, and apologies for dropping off for a moment there. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to look at bilateral, multilateral cooperation between countries like China and Canada as we kind of pursue opportunities in the digital technology space and how we apply new technologies like AI into a responsible way of evolving our society.
Great, thanks very much, Bill. And finally, Dr. Weigand.
The world has dramatically changed based on the data we create. So all I can say is I personally am extremely grateful that, as my friends say, I'm 50% German, 50% American, and 50% Chinese. Thank you for offering me all those opportunities in the last 60 years.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all three of you. We are running short of time now, so I'd like to say again, thank you for joining us here today, and thank you to everyone watching on YouTube and Bilibili. I'll now pass the reins back to our MC and look forward to the next part of the China Forum. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
谢谢。那我们今天的议程到这里就告一段落了。大家可以扫描屏幕上的二维码，关注我们的微信公众号和 Instagram， 了解更多峰会的精彩议程。明天同一时间，我们将进行峰会最后一天的议程、国际关系板块以及闭幕式。到场的嘉宾有 UBC 亚洲及跨太平洋国际关系教学教授 Paul Evans， 北大 光华管理学院副院长、国际谈判教授马丽，复旦大学国际关系教授沈丁力， UBC 政治科学教授甄汉。我们还会进行国际关系板块的圆桌论坛。闭幕式的演讲嘉宾有 Fulbright 加拿大执行董事 Michael House、资本创始人兼管理合伙人 Paul Lee 以及中国驻温哥华总领事教育参赞郭军先生。期待大家的参与，我们明天同一时间再见。